the oldest son of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King. He serves as an ambassador of his parents' legacy of nonviolent social change. As the elected president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization co-founded by his father, he reinvigorated the organization by stabilizing governance, program, and development components. As founder and president of Realizing the Dream, he took his father's message to a global audience, spearheading nonviolence training in Bosnia, India, Israel and Palestine, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and the United States. He has fought against police brutality and seeks to promote equality, peace, and justice wherever he goes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our honored guest, Mr. Martin Luther King III.
Thank you very much, and let me first thank God for the opportunity to, is this on? Bring it up. Okay, I can project if I need to. Just got it warmed up. Let me thank God for the opportunity to be here. Thank you. I want to first thank Brother Jafar for taking us around today in this community, and actually our objective always in the spirit of nonviolence is first to do information gathering. My father used 6 steps that he identified in his team to resolve conflict and crisis. And I'm going to get into those steps in a little bit, but I want to share why we are here in country today. We arrived on Friday, and our initial invitation came from a gentleman who lives in Tel Aviv, who in the 1960s had supported the work of my father very significantly by providing office space. And the business that he owned was a segregated business until he bought it. And when he bought that business, he integrated that business as one of the many things that he did to help advance the modern civil rights movement. And so we were invited for his 93rd birthday observance, but we also, organizationally wise, I work with an organization now called the Drum Major Institute that I am one of the co-founders of, along with a gentleman by the name of Bill Wachtel and another gentleman by the name of Andrew Young, who was one of the United States ambassadors during the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and also was a lieutenant of my father's. And so in that context, as a co-founder of Drum Major, I'm here with our president, Dr. Johnny Mack, who will be coming up later. We traveled from Atlanta and have been here for, as I think, 3 or 4 days, and have been on a very rigorous but interesting schedule. In the tradition of nonviolence, we often, as I said, want to meet with every community. And while we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of, as it relates to this trip, we certainly met with a lot of different people, which we believe is very good. I want to share a small perspective, because as an ambassador of the legacy of my parents, I should say my father and my mother, because my mother advanced that legacy for many years after my father's death. I was 10 years old in 1968 when my father was killed in Memphis, Tennessee. I was 11 years old when my uncle, my father's brother, mysteriously drowned. I was 16 years old when my grandmother was gunned down in her church while praying the Lord's Prayer. My father was killed by a white man. My grandmother was killed by a black man. And it would have been easy to embrace the concept of hatred. But thankfully, I chose to embrace the concept of love and embrace and learn how to forgive, which is something that we in our society don't do much, whether it is in the United States or whether it is throughout the world. Forgiving is sometimes difficult to do. But I would have been a very bitter young person had I harbored hatred. My grandfather was a Christian minister, Martin Luther King Sr. And I remember him often saying that I refuse to allow anyone, the man that killed my lovely wife, nor the man that killed my son, to reduce me to hatred. And he went on to say further that I love everybody, I'm every man's brother. That's the energy that he exhibited and disseminated throughout his life. Even as a youngster, when he saw very tragic incidents. In fact, he walked from where he lived in Georgia about 40 miles because he did not have but one pair of shoes. And so he walked barefoot so he could save the soles on his shoes and use them in the city of Atlanta. And at that time, because he had seen one of his friends' father being hung, the whites had hung this man for not really a major crime, but he was just often, blacks were strung up and hung from trees. And so he vowed to hate every white person that he saw. But it's very interesting that his life did not end up that way. He became one who personified love, as opposed to hatred. Because seeing that one incident made him, at that point when he was a young man, a young 15-year-old child, very bitter. I think he was actually 12. But when he came to Atlanta and became a minister, he changed. He did a 180-degree turn so that he would embrace love, forgiveness, and reconciliation, teaching people through his understanding of Christianity how to live in a society and create nonviolence. So it's understandable how he and his wife, Alberta Williams, could produce a Martin Luther King Jr. But he also never accepted that which was wrong. For example, my father and my grandfather, in the day when my dad was growing up, blacks were not allowed to come into stores in the front door. They had to go in the back doors. And my grandfather always walked in the front door. And he would look at one of the clerks said to him one day he came in to buy shoes. And as I said, he was a Christian minister, so he had about 3,000 members who were members of his church. And so he walked in the front door, and the clerk was very nervous. A white clerk said to him, Reverend King, if you would just come back here to the back entrance, I'll be glad to serve you. My grandfather looked at him and said, if I can't be served the way that I came in, which is the right door, the front door, then I'm going to leave your store, and I'm going to tell all my members not to come to your store. So, you know, he never stepped down from that which he saw that was wrong. My father, experienced those kinds of things over and over again with his father, which gave him a perspective and an understanding that he had to someday stand up for injustice. And he used to say that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I can't be what I ought to be until you're what you ought to be, and you can't be what you ought to be until I'm what I ought to be, because our destinies are tied together. Dad understood that at an early age and became one of those who was a leader in the modern civil rights movement. But he also understood, as a theologian and as a philosopher and as an academician, one who studied, he was one who studied and understood history. Because he was a Christian minister, he understood that as one who studied different philosophies of the world, that life did not resolve around what he and his Christianity had taught him. That we lived in a world that may have some Muslims, may have some Jews, may have some Hindus, may have some Buddhists, may have people who do not believe anything. But somehow we had to coexist. We had to learn how to live together on this planet. And he also understood that if we did not learn how to live together, he used to say that from his perspective, we must learn nonviolence, or we may face non-existence. And he taught that message and practiced and preached that message, so that in 1955, when the city of Montgomery was a very segregated city, and Miss Rosa Parks on December 1st sat down on a bus and was arrested. And I want to give you just a little bit of history, if you don't mind, but Mrs. Parks, in that day, buses were divided. The front half was reserved for white passengers. The black half was reserved for black passengers. A black passenger would have to get on the bus, put their money into the bus. When you come on the bus, you pay. Then they had to get off and enter from the rear door, and then go and sit in the back half of that bus that was reserved for black passengers. It was not uncommon for many bus drivers to have the black passengers put their money in the turnstile, and then when they got off to go to the back to enter, the buses sometimes would drive off. And so that may happen 2 or 3 times to black passengers in the course of the day. But on this day, the other thing that happened was when the white section, which was the first half of the bus, was full, then the back half where black passengers sat, if more white passengers got on, the black passengers were told to get up so the white passengers could sit down. So I wanted to give you that context because Mrs. Parks was sitting in the black section on that day, on December 1st. And the bus driver told her to get up, and she decided that she was not going to get up because she was sick and tired of being mistreated. And she was arrested. As she was arrested, my father and his team called for a boycott of the Montgomery buses for 381 days. Black people chose not to ride buses. And 60% of the ridership was black. And so as a result of not riding for almost over a year, at the end of the year, if 60% of those who ride are not riding, you've got a serious problem. They had a serious deficit and felt that they must do something different to change that behavior. And so the buses were desegregated because of that boycott. But that was just one of the first significant campaigns in my father's leadership. In fact, Mrs. Parks was the heroine of that drama, and my father became the chief spokesperson. But they did not stop there because he and others understood that there needed to be a Civil Rights Act, and there needed to be a Voting Rights Act, and there needed to be fair housing legislation. And so each successive campaign, that they were engaged in brought about significant change. There was a public policy initiative. There was a public policy initiative along with the protesting that he and his team would do in 1964 to get the Civil Rights Act, which gave us citizenship. In 1965 to get the right to vote. Some of you may have seen the film Selma. Some of that is true. The concept basically is true, but some of that is Hollywood. Some of the things that are added is called making film, making movies. It's not a documentary, so it's not totally accurate, but a lot of what happened, the basic concept is true. And so some of you may have seen the film Selma. But that is the campaign that helped create the right to vote, the legitimate right to vote. That was in 1965. And then in 1968, fair housing legislation was passed. But my father and his team had a strategic plan. So any change that we as a society want to see, oftentimes it takes a real strategic effort, a strategic focus. It takes it really does not always take the entire society, because, you know, we saw in 1963, over 200,000 people came to Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and listened to Dad deliver the I Have a Dream speech. But that was one major effort. But most of the victories were much, much smaller. Just a few good women and men that were dedicated, determined, and resilient, wanting to make a change in the nation. So it's not always the masses, but it was just a few good women and men that worked so hard to bring about change. As I said, at 10 years old, Dad was killed. And so he did not finish his work. He wanted so badly to eradicate what he called the triple evils. He called those evils the evil of poverty, the evil of racism, and the evil of militarism and violence. While significant strides were made in each one of those areas, if you were to evaluate and look at them today, and I might add, after my father's death, my mom took the leadership. Well, actually, she'd been involved in leadership even before his death. But she, in a central way, she became a very powerful leadership force in the United States from 1968 until her death in 2006. So she lived 40 plus years longer than my father and had an opportunity to, almost 40 years longer than my father, and had an opportunity to bring about social change through the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. That organization's mission was, and even today as it exists in Atlanta, is to take the philosophy of my dad and institutionalize it so that others could learn from it and utilize that methodology. Now, I talked about 6 steps. Let me give those 6 steps really quickly. And shortly I'm going to be done, for at least for speaking. The first step for any dad believed to resolve any conflict was gathering information gathering. It's research. One must understand the conflict before you can even begin to deal with it. You can't just understand one element. You have to understand the entire conflict. Information gathering. The second thing he said is you must make a personal commitment that you want to resolve this conflict. The third thing was education. So after you have gathered information, after you have gotten a personal commitment, then you must educate everyone about the issue. The fourth thing is you must sit down and negotiate what it is you want. In those first 4 steps, many conflicts can be resolved. Information, personal commitment, education, and negotiation, yes. Now, oftentimes you don't succeed at the 4th level of negotiations. So you have to go on to be engaged in direct action. That's what you saw often on television: direct action, protesting, going to jail, marching, boycotting. That's direct action. Then after the direct action comes the 6th step, which is reconciliation, bringing the communities back together to create the beloved community. And that is what my father and his team used over and over and over again. And, I hope that as I've traveled here on this visit, this is not my first visit to this country. This is probably around my 4th or 5th. But every time that I come, I learn something new. And what I am grateful to see is the resilience of the people. Because ultimately the solution or solutions are only going to come from you, the people. No one else can tell you how to resolve your conflict. We can only share a perspective of what we did, and if there's something within what we did that maybe you may be able to borrow or utilize, please do. But, one of the things about my dad and his team is they were unrelenting. They were focused in a very narrow way on justice. And they were sick and tired of being mistreated. And they decided they were not going to accept it anymore. And that's the spirit that they came to the table with. And because they didn't engage in violence, what the Western world understands very well is how to violently take you out. And how to violently, if you do violence, they understand that very well. And they use violence only begets violence. It's just like darkness cannot put out darkness. Only light can put out darkness. And so violence will never resolve violence. Yes, temporarily, you may say, well, I'm winning temporarily. But ultimately, violence is not going to be the answer to any of the world, even stage conflicts that exist. Violence can stop something maybe for a moment. But we believe in the tradition of nonviolence, that nonviolence is what creates ultimate change. That when you treat people with dignity and respect, and you deal with the humanity of who a person or people are, that is when you have the best chance of creating a positive outcome. But when you mistreat people, people will get tired of being mistreated. And people sometimes do extreme things. I'm going to give you two examples. In the United States, some of you heard about Ferguson, Missouri, where a young African-American man was killed by police. And what you did not hear, because Western press did not show it to you, was that 95% of the protests that occurred over a year and a half were nonviolent protests. So less than 5% of the protests were negative and violent protests. There was one incident where the stepfather of Michael Brown stood up and said, "Burn it down." And that's what the media showed you. And on that 1 or 2 days, there was violence. Maybe even for an entire week there was violence. A week. Now a week is a small amount of time when you're talking about 300 plus days in a year that people are marching and demonstrating nonviolently, which they did. Actually, they did for almost 2 years. But the media took that one incident, and that's what they ran across the world. And so people have a negative impression of what happened in Ferguson and what the people of Ferguson did, as opposed to looking at the entire context and saying, okay, there were a few days where some bad things happened. But if you look at the overall context, it was very positive. Now, on the other hand, let's look at South Carolina, where a white man came into a church and killed 8 members of that church, the pastor and 7 members. And if you look at how those members who were impacted, those victims, responded, all of them responded in a different way. They chose to respond by saying, hate is not going to win. We're not going to go out and kill white folks because this one white person killed, 8 black people. We know that hatred is not going to win. In fact, we forgive this misguided young man. And the entire community began to come together. And in the United States, there's something called a Confederate flag, which was the battle flag that the South used to say we want to keep slavery intact. That's the way many black people saw it. And over many of the southern states, the flag that was flown was the Confederate flag. Many of us have been working years to try to get that Confederate flag removed. And because of that incident and the way those eight families dealt with the losing of their loved ones, there was a tectonic shift in the energy in the United States, and the flags came down because of how they chose to operate. That shows you how love, forgiveness overcomes hatred and hostility. Because if they had acted hatefully, people would have been very upset, but they would have at least intellectually, you understand. Somebody does something to me, then I'm going to do something to someone else. I mean, really think about it. You know, we live in a society that believes maybe in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But if that philosophy worked, most of us wouldn't have eyes or teeth. So obviously that can't be the solution. There's got to be a higher solution that human beings must evolve to, a much higher level. Not the level of barbarism where you're operating as animals do. You have to operate, that's why I believe that human beings are God's highest creation. That's what my father believed, that's what he taught, that's what he lived and died for. And in fact, interestingly enough, he died in a very violent way. He never used a gun, or never used a bomb, or never used a stick or a brick. He always used love, the love ethic. And that, I think, is very appropriate even today in conflicts that exist around our world. Now, I hope that in the days and years and months and years and days to come, that somehow to speak specifically to what I've seen today. And what I've seen are conditions that are unjust, that are unfair, that are unnecessary. But only you as a collective have the ability to address them. I mean, I can certainly say and will use my voice as much as possible. But it is you and your community, along with others who empathize with your community. The world is much smaller than it was. And although we have elements in our world of terrorism, the world is a much better place than sometimes the behavior that is exhibited. We are much better people than sometimes the behavior we exhibit. I am convinced that it only takes a few good women and men to bring about change. How do I know that? Because I saw it done over and over and over again during my father's era. It does not mean that all the victories and all the victory has been won. It means that over and over again, victories did occur. And I say to you that I am convinced that wherever there's injustice, things can change. Victor Hugo used to say that wherever there's darkness, crimes will occur. But the guilty one is not merely he who commits the crime, but it's those who create the darkness. We can and we must do better. We are a better world than some of the behavior that we see exhibited. Never in life should anyone be mistreated. There's never a reason to mistreat a human being. There may be, sometimes we do things wrong, and in a civil society, we have jails. So sometimes when you do wrong, maybe one has to go to jail for what they've done that's wrong. But there's never a reason to mistreat another human being. That is wrong, and the world energetically understands and knows that. We are here to be available to help and support the things that you do. I can't thank Mossawa enough for what it represents and the leadership that is provided in this community, along with others, because there's not one person or group. It really is a collective of people who come together, of good women and men. It really has to be beyond just one group. My dad was able to ultimately garner, in fact, this is probably why he was killed. He was talking about a radical redistribution of wealth in 1967 and 68. He was able to bring together blacks and whites, and his last campaign was called the Poor People's Campaign. He did not live to see it come to fruition, where he was going to bring together blacks and whites and Native Americans and Latino and Hispanic Americans and Americans from all walks of life to say to policymakers, we demand the right to decent jobs with decent pay. Now that was very frightening to the powers to be, because it no longer was just black folk. It was black folk and others who happened to be in poverty. And that was, they felt of danger. And so they decided that he had to be killed. And that's basically what happened. But his message lives on today. We observe his birthday every year in the United States, and over 100 countries around the world observe his birthday, because that message reverberates throughout the world. And that message is needed even now. So let me end with these words. When I was a child, my mom took me to her undergraduate college, which the name of that college is Antioch College, which was based in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And at that college was the educator, a statue of the educator Horace Mann. And on that statue was an inscription under the statue. And those words read, "Be ashamed to die until you've won a victory for humanity." I was about 14 years old when I first saw that statue and those words. And I remember saying to myself, wow, that's quite a major statement. Be ashamed to die until you won a victory for humanity. And I started thinking about that. And I said, you know, one can win a victory in your neighborhood. You can win a victory. Some will win victories in their schools. Some may win victories in their places of worship. Some may win victories in their states. Some may win victories in their regions. And some may win victories in their country. And some, better yet, may even win victories in the world. What those words mean are, be ashamed to die until you've done a little something to make the world in which we all must live a little better than it was when you arrived. Thank you, and may God bless each of you.